Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of Hayden Newberry Fishing. Tonight, we're in the camper talking about what baits made the most money in the Elite Series this year. So, essentially, these will be the best money making baits from the top 10s this season. These are all kind of cumulative numbers of how many of them made the top 10 the most. So, essentially, these would be the ones that made the most money throughout the season. Kind of tough to go through the entire field and tell you guys from there, but this is what baits were shown as their topplers throughout the entire season, and kind of interesting numbers. I did this last year, and I will say that there's a few that are the same, but there's a few that kind of are surprising, but not surprising when you look at what was on the schedule. But just some things that I like to point out because it's the same thing as last year on a few of them that are these big name things and these techniques that people really go after when they talk about catching bigger fish and stuff, but seem to not really show up when it comes down to this right here that is what made money. So, anyway, without further ado, we're going to get through these numbers here and talk through it with you guys. So, I'm going to give some context to all these too because if I just read them off to you, it really wouldn't make a lot of sense because we're going from Florida early in the year, slowly working our way up, kind of doing southern fisheries, and then going up north. So obviously, there's certain parts of the country that some of these came from. So some of the ones that finished higher up weren't necessarily used in a lot of tournaments. They were just only used in maybe two of the tournaments of the year, and we'll get to that. But number one, which not very surprising, and I think that if I remember right, it might have been number one last year, and for the same reason, is the drop shot, but it tied with the Senko. So the drop shot, and I actually split it up this year because I didn't want to make it misleading, and there's a reason why I'm saying the top 10 baits, but then I'm calling it a drop shot. So I actually split up a drop shot with a straight tail worm that was fished deep on like brush piles and stuff is different than a drop shot with like a flat worm on it that you're fishing up north. So when you're up north fishing for smallmouth, you're going to see a whole bunch of different variations of the same thing. So they're going to go to a smallmouth fishery, and the top 10's all going to be fishing a drop shot with the same weight, the same length leader on it, and a little bit different variation of some type of like little flatworm or a little bitty straight tail swim bait or maybe a Ned rig on sideways on the drop shot. That's all. Like I'm not gonna say it was a Zoom TRD used this many times and I'm not a Zoom you guys know what I'm trying to say. Anyway, this type of Ned rig that was fished sideways on a drop shot. I'm not gonna do that. It's essentially the same bait when we're talking about this because it's like a chatterbait. You can rig a chatterbait up with 17 different trailers on it, but it's still a chatterbait. So traditional smallmouth drop shot was actually split up from the other one because I didn't want to drive up the numbers because it's two completely different techniques, truthfully, because you're not fishing for individual smallmouth and stuff. So the northern style drop shot tied for first with the Senko. Now, the Senko was used all over the country. There was a few that it showed up north. It was used a whole bunch down south because they fished a whole lot of tournaments where they were spawning, just slightly post spawn, a little bit pre spawn, a lot of shallow fishing going on. So wacky rig Senko's down south, a little bit up north. The Senko was definitely way more diverse because the drop shot literally was the last three tournaments of the year. And primarily two of the last two because the not St. Clair, but the Champlain tournament didn't actually have as many drop shots as you would expect. It had, which we'll get to it, but all in a couple tournaments. So if you think that just because the drop shot traditionally finished first, and this is just like last year, I think I explained kind of this exact same thing that you can just go out in Florida because it's the number one bait that cashes money in the Elite Series. It wasn't showing up in the top 10s in Florida. So, second place, this is where it gets more interesting to me, because Cinco, it's like, yeah, duh. Spawning tournaments, you can throw a wacky rig around, drop shot up north. It's like, yeah, you see a smallmouth on live scope, you toss a drop shot over there, they eat it. Second was a creature bait. Like, and what I'm calling a creature bait is pretty much variations of crawls, stuff like that guys are flipping. Again, last year I think it took first place. And kind of the same thing. I almost think that the obvious baits aren't so interesting in this scenario because there was so many spawning tournaments, so many tournaments where guys were flipping laydowns, flipping to bedfish, fishing creature baits across beds. Florida, I mean, Seminole. You look at the first 4 tournaments of the season was where a lot of those were used. There was a few of them kind of showed up north, but not many at all. So, first and second are compromised, and that was showed up 15 times, so it was a very close second. But Cinco, creature bait, drop shot. Third, coming in third at 13. So this is, to me, a more interesting one, and I split it up also specifically to a swim jig coming in third, because a traditional jig and a swim jig are 2 completely different techniques. So if I just put all the jigs together, that's like, doesn't really do it justice. So if I would have, the swim jig or the jig traditionally would have came in second, but swim jig was split up because there were so many swim jigs used this season down south. Again, swim jigs are just a killer in pre-spawn, spawning tournaments, post-spawn tournaments. That technique is such a good technique for big tournaments like that. It's a power fishing technique that isn't so erratic and loud and everything is like a spinner bait or a chatter bait. Just swimming a jig through shallow cover in shallow areas wins a lot of money, and there's a lot of people that don't necessarily use it as much as they probably should. But a swim jig was used the 3rd most to win money in the Elite Series, or 4th most, I guess, because we were on the 4th one. But it's way up there. Used 13 times in the top 10s, and none of them were up north. That was all Southern tournaments. And then coming in 4th, actually a tie for 4th. So this is a very interesting one, because last year it wasn't this high. At 11 times showing up in the top 10, one of these is interesting. The other one's like, yeah, chatterbait. So a chatterbait, obviously, Florida, Southern Lakes, same thing as a swim jig. It's a swim jig, to me, is more productive in big tournaments because it is just a little bit more subtle than a chatterbait. It can be fished in a little bit clearer water. A chatterbait can be, but swim jigs are just, to me, a little bit more effective when it comes to getting bigger bites up shallow. But a frog came in the top 10 11 times this season. And in the era of you got to have live scope's everything, we're looking at a frog being one of the most productive money-making baits in the Elite Series this year was a frog. And I can tell you that there's just, that doesn't match up with live scope a lot. Maybe there was somebody that was live scoping them up shallow, but there was some of that done. But I liked seeing the frog way up there. The frog was actually used a lot this season. Steve Kennedy almost won down in Florida with it, and it was used on the Sabine, places like that. The Sabine was not a live scope tournament. So on to 5th place. So this is another smallmouth thing, and it was almost all of these of the 10 were from Champlain, because if you didn't watch the event, it was the Demiki rig. Now, I looped a lot of things. This was a tough one. So I called anything that was traditionally, you look at it, it looks like a Demiki rig, but a lot of people picture fishing a Demiki rig vertically, which is kind of what it is. But that tournament was used, so I put an asterisk next to this because St. Clair or Champlain, they were chasing a lot of deep schools of smallmouth chasing bait. And so a lot of guys were using heavy Damiki rigs and casting it out to them, even light Damiki rigs to cast out to those fish under the surface and swimming it back by them. So I want you to know that also the Damiki rig wasn't necessarily used the traditional way, but it's not really, to me, that's not really I wouldn't call it a swim bait. It kind of is, but it's kind of not, and it's a kind of a gray area on that one. It was really hard to decide what to put it, but there was just so many. I almost would call that almost irrelevant information because it was literally one term of the year that if you weren't using it, apparently you weren't in the top 10, and that was on Champlain, just because of the way they were fishing for them. So next up, the shallow crankbait wasn't this high last year. So next up, it tied with the jerkbait. So the jerkbait showed up 7 times this year. Shallow crankbait, and what I call like a square bill or anything, all of them, all the crankbaits I saw, I didn't see one deep diving. There was not one deep diving crankbait in the top 10s this entire year. Every single one of them was some type of shallower crank of the 7 crankbaits that I saw, which is another interesting thing. But they weren't ever on the Tennessee River in like summer or anything like that. So you would have, I guarantee you would have seen some deep diving crankbaits had they went, or if they would have went to Lake Fork. If they would have went to Lake Fork again, you would have seen deep diving crankbaits up there, and that was what happened last year. The only deep diving crankbaits I think were like a Tennessee River, and then a ton of them on Lake Fork. So, shallow crankbaits, jerkbaits. You guys know they were fishing jerkbaits, live scoping them. The tournament on Okeechobee this season, first tournament of the year in Florida, was won on a jerkbait live scoping, which is dumb, but that's how it was won, and not fun to watch. But they're apparently talking that out a little bit. I've heard rumors that there's a possibility live scope's going to get outlawed next season, which if it does, it does, I guess. That's a topic for a different video, I think. So next up, swim bait, and this is not a big swim bait. I separated them because a glide bait and a large soft plastic swim bait to me are different than your like 3.5 inch Kitex. So just smaller swim baits, like just a swim bait, showed up 6 times, and then a swimming worm 6 times. So where did the swimming worm show up? Florida, Southern Lakes, Florida. It was all Florida. There was, I want to say I saw a swimming worm show up in the Sabine. I looked through so many baits and stuff making this list that it was tough to remember, but I think I saw somebody that weighed fishing with one on the Sabine, but I might be wrong on that one. Anyway, that's a Florida thing. If you're fishing in Florida, you better be fishing a swimming worm. If you want to make money in Florida, have a swimming worm out, because if you don't, you're gonna miss out on a bite somewhere along the way. Next up, number 5. Love to see this one up there too. Spinnerbait. It was the same thing last year. It's a little bit higher than last year actually though. Spinnerbaits, in that many southern tournaments, which I think just so many people have started fishing chatterbaits more primarily, that spinnerbaits have kind of fall on the wayside, but super effective. And just every time I see that they don't show up as much in top 10s, it just surprises me. But maybe it's just because I wish they would, because I like fishing them so much. But spinnerbait showed up five times throughout top 10s, all in southern tournaments. You were not seeing spinnerbaits up north for smallmouth. Fluke, weightless fluke style baits, 4 times tied with walking baits. So I think almost all of those walking baits showed up on Lake Murray, but fluke style bait, walking bait, and shaky head. I separated shaky head worms out just as a different bait than just like a worm, because if I put all worms in a thing together as being a specific thing, then you'd have Texas rigs, everything. So shaky head, that's why you see some variations, like almost a technique as a bait, because you got to separate and draw a line somewhere. And as a fisherman, this is where I figured out the lines should be. So shaky head showed up 4 times tied with a fluke, a walking bait, traditional jig, so like a flipping jig, I saw no football jigs showed up this entire season. Just a traditional jig um, that definitely wasn't a swim jig showed up 3 times, and that tied with one, two, three, four, five, six, 7 other baits. So there was a huge amount of these. So this was something that I don't think, if I remember correctly, last year we didn't see as much of, was a bunch down at the bottom. I felt like there was here and there and stuff, but there was a bunch of them in this category here. So I'm gonna kind of read through them here. Traditional jig, prop bait. So I called anything. So I looped prop baits down in Florida, which I didn't see a lot of those show up, which was interesting. I think, and then a plopper I looped in with the prop bait because, and I probably shouldn't have done that, but 2 of those were ploppers, and then 1 was an actual prop bait. Buzz bait, 3. I don't think the buzzbait showed up at all last year in the top 10s. It showed up 3 times this year, which they went to the Sabine. That was a couple of them. Drop shot worm with a straight worm on it. So this is a drop shot fished in like southern brush piles. That if you have fished a drop shot in southern lakes, you probably know exactly what I'm talking about. That is different than what you fish up north for smallmouth. It's to me technically should be categorized differently. So drop shot worm showed up 3 times, and it won down on Seminole. So it was a big player in the season, just wasn't utilized, I guess, as much to win any tournaments. A big swim bait was used 3 times, and that is a big soft plastic swim bait. I'm still not to glide baits yet. So same thing as last year. We're getting kind of far down on the list now, and you're not seeing glide baits show up very much. And I felt like that was a big talk last year. Still is a big talk, and it's probably not going away. But they are effective in some tournaments. Popper. I don't think it might have showed up in 1 tournament last year. It showed up in a few. Again, the Sabine brought in some kind of different shallow baits because those tidal water fish, you can throw out a few different techniques to get those. Swim jigs, poppers, frogs. There's quite a few different techniques you can use to catch those tidal water fish. So you'll see those tournaments having kind of a variety of different shallow water baits. It's almost like a smallmouth fishery when you see a bunch of guys with different techniques of like drop shots, like different baits on a drop shot. The shallow water fish in tidal rivers, it seems like there's quite a few different techniques you can use to catch them. It's just kind of pick your strength there. A Nico rig showed up a few times. If you're familiar with what a Nico rig is, it deserves to be in a category of its own because it is kind of a very different way to fish a worm. Showed up 3 times. Only 1 of them was in a southern fishery, and I'll tell you exactly where it was. Paul Mueller on Santee Cooper was catching some giants on it, and he was live scoping individual fish out on the flats up there, throwing a little bitty Nico out there and catching them. And then a Ned rig showed up 3 times, which it was one of those northern swings that the Ned rig didn't produce a lot. I don't know if it's been overfished up there or if it's kind of a live scope that guys have figured out that drop shot and a few other things are a little more effective than a Ned rig, but didn't show up much at all this season. So we're down to the last ones, and there's a little bit of an interesting one in here. Glide bait, spy bait, and a flutter spoon. Flutter spoon showed up in a place that it shouldn't have, and it was I'm gonna butcher this guy's name, but I think it's Fuyoto Fujita. Maybe that's his name. I'll say some of the creature baits that I had to call him, that was JDM creature baits, the Japanese tackle. He fishes some weird stuff. That flutter spoon came in at Lake Champlain up north. So what I was talking about, those guys were chasing these fish out in deep water. That flutter spoon was in the top 10 baits from Lake Champlain. So this guy was catching smallmouth on a flutter spoon, which is definitely a different technique. Nobody else was doing it. and he was the only one to use one for the top 10 for the entire season. He is really good, and he brings in a whole bunch of really just new stuff. If you look through the top tens, every time he's in there, he's got something different. He's got some of that Japanese tackle that a lot of people don't use. Spy bait, that was a northern thing. I can't remember who it was that used it, but it was up north. And then a glide bait showed up one time, Southern Lakes. Other than that, that was it. There really was a lot of diversity at the bottom, but it's starting to show through that on the Elite Series, when you're down south, creature baits dominate. Obviously, Cincos, stuff like that. When you go up north, you see all the drop shots and smallmouth techniques arise, but not really a whole lot of surprises this year. But good to see some of the stuff at the bottom, because last year I don't think anybody made a top 10 with a buzzbait, and hopefully next year we see a little bit more stuff like that. And I think we definitely are going to be able to see some interesting mix-ups. If they ban live scope, I would love to compare this year's and even last year's together, the top 10 baits that made the most money, and then compare them to a year without live scope and see if you actually see a difference, or if it's the same stuff, if guys just catch them on the same stuff no matter what they're using. Anyway, thanks for watching the video, guys. See you on the next one. Appreciate it.